The night is quiet now, and that is exactly the kind of night this story wants. So let the room settle around you. Let your shoulders loosen against the pillow, and let a voice that has spent a long time with the past sit down beside you in the dark. Tonight, we are not going anywhere. We are simply going back. In much of medieval Europe, falling in love the wrong way could cost a person everything they had. Not their pride, not their reputation though, that too. Their freedom, their standing before you. In some documented cases, their life. A glance held too long could become a legal matter. A love charm given in good faith could become an accusation of witchcraft. A man's wounded honour over a woman he barely knew could end in a sword drawn at dawn. Love in this world was rarely a private thing. It was watched, judged, and sometimes punished. Picture a market town in northern France sometime in the early 1300s. A young woman stands at the edge of a churchyard wall, a small linen pouch pressed flat inside her sleeve. Inside it, dried rosemary, a pinch of crushed rue, a sliver of parchment folded so small it could pass for nothing at all. She had made it for a boy 2 houses down the miller's son, who she had loved quietly since they were children, playing along the same muddy lane. She had not meant for anyone to see, but her neighbours had seen her crouched by the hedgerow at dusk, murmuring something over the herbs before she wrapped them, and by the time the sun rose twice more, the parish priest had heard of it. Within the week she was standing before the local court, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white, answering questions about what exactly she had whispered into the dark. She was not a witch, she was a girl in love, who did not fully understand how dangerous that could be. But in that room on that morning, the difference between the two was not as clear as it should have been. Stories like hers were not rare, and that is part of what makes this history so strange to sit with now. We tend to imagine medieval romance as something soft and distant, all troubadours and stolen glances across a banquet hall, a world of chivalry wrapped in velvet and candlelight. And some of that is true. But underneath the poetry was a system of real consequence, one where the church, the family, and sometimes the entire village had a say in who you were allowed to want and how far you were allowed to show it. A woman's reputation could be undone by a single look held 1 second too long. A man could be legally bound to another family for the rest of his life over a promise made in front of witnesses he barely knew. And astrologers, priests, and physicians all claimed some authority over the timing, the method, and even the morality of desire itself. It is a world that took love seriously enough to regulate it, and that regulation shaped almost everything about how two people were permitted to find each other at all. Tonight we are going to walk slowly through that world together. We will look at the unspoken rules that governed something as small as eye contact in a crowded church, and why holding someone's gaze a moment too long could be read as either devotion or scandal. We will follow the strange language people use to hide their feelings inside religious verse, because saying I love you plainly could be seen as sinful, while comparing a woman to a saint was somehow safe. We will sit with the real, documented cases of women accused of witchcraft simply for trying to help love along with herbs their grandmothers had used for generations, and we will ask what those trials tell us about who medieval society was truly afraid of. We will watch men draw swords over a glance that was never even meant for them, in duels that had almost nothing to do with the women they claimed to defend. And by the end of this night, we will understand something that rarely makes it into the romantic version of this era, that behind every gesture of medieval courtship, however delicate it appears now, there was often real risk sitting quietly underneath it. Before we go further into that world, I want to ask something small of you. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the kind that takes its time and takes the past seriously. If it is, take a moment now to subscribe and leave the video a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who might need a quiet, honest hour like this one. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight and what drew you to a story like this one in particular. I read every single one and it means more than you would think. Now let yourself get comfortable and let's begin. Because to understand what happened to that young woman by the churchyard wall and to thousands like her, across the centuries that followed, we have to first understand the world she was born into. A world where the church did not simply preach about love, it tried to legislate it. Where astrology was not superstition on the margins, but a serious discipline consulted by nobles and peasants alike before a proposal was ever spoken aloud. Where a family's honour was tied so closely to a daughter's conduct that a single rumour could unravel a marriage arrangement years in the making. It was a world built on hierarchy, surveillance and faith, and into that world ordinary people still fell in love anyway, quietly, stubbornly, the way people always have. What changes across the centuries is not the feeling itself. It is everything that stood in its way. A crowded church on a Sunday morning is in some ways the last place we would expect to find danger. And yet in towns across medieval Europe, that was precisely where much of this unspoken code of desire was tested, because it was one of the only places where men and women who were not related by blood or already promised to each other were permitted to stand in close proximity at all. There is a particular detail that surprises people when they first come across it. Historians studying parish records and penitential manuals have found that the position of a woman's gaze during Mass, whether it rested on the altar on her own hands or worst of all on a man across the aisle, was something priests were trained to notice and occasionally to address directly from the pulpit. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread this level of scrutiny actually was, since much of what survives comes from instructional text written for clergy rather than direct accounts of enforcement. But the fact that such guidance existed at all tells us something important. The eyes were not considered a small private matter. They were treated as an instrument capable of real spiritual and social consequence, and controlling where a woman looked was treated as seriously as controlling what she said. This is where the idea of the courtly gaze comes from, a concept that sounds almost poetic until you understand what stood behind it. Manuals of courtly conduct, several of which survive from the 12th and 13th centuries, describe an ideal manner of looking that a well-bred woman was meant to master. Not blank, not cold, but composed. Distant enough to suggest she was untouched by worldly want, present enough to seem neither rude nor cloistered. A wandering glance, held even a beat too long, could be read by onlookers as an invitation, and an invitation carried weight far beyond the moment itself. It could shape rumour. It could shape a marriage negotiation already underway with another family. In a society where a woman's value was so tightly bound to her perceived virtue, something as fleeting as where her eyes rested for a second or two could ripple outward into consequences that lasted years. For men the rules were different but no less exacting. A gentleman was expected to hold a gaze just long enough to communicate sincerity and to look away at precisely the right moment to avoid the accusation of forwardness. There is a strange, almost tender logic underneath this. The system was not designed to prevent affection outright. It was designed to make affection legible so that everyone watching the family, the priest, the wider community, could interpret exactly what was happening without a word ever being spoken aloud. Love in this world had to be performed within a very narrow and closely monitored range of expression, and stepping outside that range even by accident could shift how an entire village understood a person's character. The Church's involvement in all of this was not incidental, it was structural. Canon law across much of medieval Christendom held that marriage itself required consent, which on its surface sounds almost progressive for the period. A man and a woman were in theory supposed to agree to their union freely without coercion. But in practice, the space in which that consent could form a glance, a conversation, a walk taken with a chaperone nearby, was so heavily supervised that genuine free choice often existed only within the thin margins the church and family allowed. Priests preached regularly against what they called excessive familiarity, a phrase broad enough to cover everything from prolonged eye contact to standing too close during a festival dance. The underlying anxiety was almost always the same. That desire left unwatched could unravel the careful social order that kept property lineage and inheritance moving in the direction families intended. And this is where something quietly remarkable happens. Something that rarely gets mentioned in popular retellings of medieval romance. Despite all of this surveillance, people found ways to communicate desire that the watching eyes around them could not easily punish. A woman might drop a glove near a man she favoured seemingly by accident in a gesture that could always be explained away as clumsiness if anyone asked. A man might arrange to walk the same road at the same hour each week, never speaking, simply present until the pattern itself became its own quiet declaration. These small deniable acts formed an entire second language, one built specifically to survive inside a system designed to suppress it. In a strange way, the very restrictions meant to control affection ended up shaping some of its most inventive and enduring expressions, the kind of coded gestures that would eventually evolve into the elaborate courtly rituals, the flowers, the tokens, the carefully worded verses that people still associate with medieval romance today. It's worth pausing here on something that complicates the picture further. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how uniformly these rules were enforced across different regions and social classes. What survives in the historical record leans heavily toward the practices of nobility and clergy, simply because those were the people who had the literacy and the means to write conduct manuals and canon law commentary in the first place. Peasant courtship, the version practiced by the overwhelming majority of medieval people, is far harder to reconstruct with precision. What fragments do survive court records where a village accused a couple of impropriety church court testimony about broken betrothal promises suggest that ordinary people negotiated these boundaries with a good deal more flexibility than the aristocratic manuals imply. A field, a well, a shared task like harvesting or spinning wool, these were places where young men and women worked side by side out of necessity, and where a degree of familiarity simply could not be avoided the way it might be in a noble household with servants and chaperones at every turn. The rules, in other words, were never applied evenly. They bent according to how much a family had to lose. That unevenness matters because it reveals something true about every system built to control desire throughout history. The people with the least power to lose were often watched the least closely, not because they were trusted more, but because their choices carried less weight in the eyes of those who governed land, wealth, and lineage. A noblewoman's glance could threaten an alliance between two houses. A miller's daughter's glance threatened almost nothing beyond her own family's modest reputation, and so the scrutiny she faced, while still real, operated on a different scale entirely. This is part of what makes the story of the young woman from the churchyard, the one we sat with a little earlier, tonight so striking. She was not nobility, she had no estate to protect, no alliance riding on her conduct. And yet the fear that surrounded love magic, real or imagined, cut across class lines in a way that eye contact and glances never quite did. Desire itself might be regulated differently depending on who you were born to, but the fear of desire taking an unnatural or uncontrollable form, that fear reached everyone. It is that fear and where it truly came from that begins to shape the next part of this story. Because underneath the poetry, the manuals, and the careful choreography of glances, there was a deeper anxiety running through medieval society, one that had less to do with romance and far more to do with control, and with what happened when people believed that love could be summoned, bent, or forced by means outside the boundaries the church had drawn. The body itself, it turns out, was never really left alone in this world either. If the eyes were watched for what they revealed, the skin, the breath, and the space around a person's body were watched for something else entirely, for what they suggested about a person's inner state, their virtue, even their spiritual health. And nowhere does this become clearer or stranger to modern ears than in the medieval relationship with scent. Bathing in much of medieval Europe was not the daily ritual we take for granted now. Water had to be hauled and heated by hand, often over a fire that consumed fuel. A household could not always spare, and in colder regions physicians actually advised against frequent bathing, believing that opening the pores too often left the body vulnerable to disease carried on bad air. This idea, sometimes called miasma theory, held real medical authority for centuries. It was not laziness or ignorance that kept most people from washing often. It was a genuine, if mistaken, belief that doing so could kill you. And into that gap between the natural human desire to be found appealing and the very real barriers standing in the way of simple cleanliness, an entire culture of scent management quietly grew. Consider a household in rural England somewhere in the middle of the 1300s. A woman preparing for a Saints' Day gathering does not reach for water and soap the way we might imagine. She reaches instead for a small bundle of dried herbs kept near the hearth, rosemary, most likely sometimes lavender, if her family had the means to grow it, and she works the leaves gently between her palms until the oils release, then presses that scent along her wrists, behind her ears, into the folds of her sleeves. This was not vanity in the way we might dismiss it today. It was in its own quiet way an act of care both for herself and for the people she would stand close to that day. Herbs were understood to have protective qualities as much as pleasant ones. Rosemary in particular was believed to ward off both illness and what people of the time called ill fortune. So wearing it served a double purpose, smelling agreeable while also in the minds of those who wore it, offering a kind of spiritual protection. Wealthier households had far more elaborate options, and this is where the connection between scent and social status becomes almost impossible to separate from the connection between scent and desirability. A pomander, a small perforated ball often made of gold or silver and filled with a paste of ambergris musk or dried citrus peel, was worn on a chain at the waist by those who could afford it, and it did more than mask odour. It announced wealth every time the wearer moved through a room. To smell of imported spice in a world where cinnamon and clove had travelled thousands of miles by ship and caravan was to visibly display resources most people would never possess in a lifetime. Saffron, worth at times more than its weight in silver, was occasionally rubbed into fine fabric specifically so that a garment itself would carry the scent, meaning a person's very presence in a room could announce their family's fortune before they said a single word. This is where something genuinely surprising emerges from the historical record, something that challenges the easy assumption that medieval attraction was purely about appearance or status. Several surviving herbal manuscripts and household guides, particularly from the 12th and 13th centuries, describe scent as something believed to reflect a person's inner moral character, not merely their outward wealth. A woman who smelled of clean herbs was thought by some writers of the period to possess a settled, virtuous temperament, while foul or neglected scent was occasionally linked, at least in moralizing texts written by clergy, to laziness or even spiritual corruption. Scholars still debate how literally ordinary people took these claims in daily life, since much of what survives comes from didactic writing, meant to instruct rather than simply describe how people actually behaved. But the fact that scent carried this kind of symbolic moral weight at all tells us something important about how thoroughly the physical and the spiritual were entangled in the medieval imagination. The body was never just a body. It was a visible and apparently smellable expression of the soul inside it. For men, the expectations were slightly different, though no less specific. Manuals of courtly conduct occasionally advised gentlemen to carry small sachets of herbs tucked into their boots or sleeves, less as an act of overt seduction, and more as a demonstration of what might be called effort, the same quiet signal a well-kept beard or carefully mended cloak might send. A man who smelled faintly of rosemary rather than sweat and livestock was understood to be someone who took his appearance seriously enough to prepare for company. And in an agrarian society where most men spent their days doing physical labour alongside animals, that small act of preparation carried real social weight. It said without a word being spoken that this was a man capable of setting aside his working self at least for an evening and presenting something closer to his best self instead. But it would be a mistake to imagine this world as one of universal fragrance and floral charm, because poverty shaped this landscape just as powerfully as it shaped every other aspect of medieval life. For the vast majority of people, herbs of any kind, even common ones like rosemary and mint, required land time and a garden that could be spared from growing food. A poor labourer working from dawn until dusk simply to keep a family fed had neither the leisure nor the resources to cultivate scent in the way wealthier households could. What survives of peasant life suggests that many people simply lived with the smell of their labour, of wood smoke, of animals, of the fields themselves, and that this was understood quietly and without much comment as simply the way things were. There is something worth sitting with in that, the elaborate, almost theatrical relationship with scent that survives in courtly manuals and noble correspondence was never the universal medieval experience. It was like so much of what we associate with romantic ritual from this period largely a privilege of those who already had privilege to spare. And yet even within that unevenness something recognisably human keeps surfacing. Even the poorest households, according to surviving folk remedies and local customs recorded by later folklorists, held on to small low-cost rituals meant to signal care and attraction. A sprig of wild thyme tucked behind an ear cost nothing but the effort of walking to a hedgerow and picking it. A young man might rub crushed mint leaves along his jaw before a village festival, not because any manual told him to, but because the gesture had passed down through generations of people doing the same small hopeful thing before them. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how widespread these particular folk practices were, since so much of what we know comes from records written generations later, but the pattern itself of ordinary people finding small, accessible ways to prepare themselves for the people they hope to impress appears again and again across regions and centuries. It suggests something worth remembering whenever we look back on eras that feel distant and strange to us now. The instinct to want to be found appealing, to make some small effort in the presence of someone we hope will notice us, did not begin with modern perfume counters and bathroom mirrors. It is old, far older than soap and far older than the elaborate courtly rituals that grew up around it. There is one more layer to this that deserves a quiet moment of its own, because it complicates the picture in a way that feels almost tender. Several medieval physicians writing within what we now call humoral medicine believed that scent did not simply mask the body, but actively interacted with a person's internal balance, their humours as the theory called them, the fluids believed to govern temperament and health. A pleasant scent was thought to soothe an agitated humour, while a foul one could unsettle it further. This meant that when a medieval man or woman dabbed herbs onto their skin before meeting someone they hoped to attract, they were not only trying to smell appealing in the way we understand today, they believed at some level that they were adjusting their very physiology, calming themselves, steadying their own nerves through scent in a way that feels strikingly close to instincts we still recognise now. The candle lit before a difficult conversation, the specific fragrance kept for important days. The reasoning behind it has changed almost entirely. The impulse underneath it has not changed at all. What begins to take shape then is a portrait of a world where nearly every visible and sensory detail of a person, the direction of their gaze, the scent trailing from their sleeve, carried meaning far beyond what it seems to carry today, meaning that could shape how a person was perceived, judged and desired long before a single word passed between two people. And once words did enter the picture, once desire moved from the unspoken language of glances and herbs into something a person actually dared to write down, an entirely different and even more delicate set of dangers began to take shape, because saying what you felt in this world was rarely as simple as it sounds. Speech itself, once a person finally worked up the courage to use it, turned out to be the most dangerous tool of all. And this is where the story takes a turn that surprises most people who assume medieval romance was simply flowery and formal by choice, rather than necessity. To understand why it helps to sit for a moment with what the church actually taught about desire in this period. Romantic longing between two unmarried people was not treated as neutral or even mildly improper. In the theological framework that shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, desire outside the bounds of marriage was understood as a form of sin, something dangerously close to lust, and lust sat near the top of the list of transgressions a soul needed to guard against. A person could not simply write to someone they admired and say plainly that they found them beautiful, or that their heart quickened in that person's company. Such language risked being read not as romance, but as confession of moral weakness, the kind of thing a priest might raise during confession, or worse, the kind of thing that could damage a family's reputation if the letter ever fell into the wrong hands. And so an entire literary tradition grew up specifically to solve this problem, one that let people express longing while keeping one careful foot inside the boundaries of piety. This is the origin of what scholars now call courtly love poetry, and it produces some of the strangest, most beautiful, and occasionally most confusing writing to survive from the period. A suitor wishing to praise a woman's beauty would very rarely describe her directly. Instead, he might compare her to the Virgin Mary to a cathedral window, catching morning light to a saint whose feast day happened to fall near the date of their meeting. On its surface, this reads almost as evasion, a way of avoiding the risk of saying anything too bold. But something more interesting was happening underneath it. By elevating the object of his affection to the language of the sacred, a medieval poet was doing two things at once. He was protecting himself from accusations of impropriety, since who could object to comparing a woman's grace to holiness? And he was in a strange way arguing that his feelings were not carnal at all, but something closer to devotion, the kind a person might feel toward the divine itself. Whether this was sincere belief or clever self-protection likely depended entirely on the individual writing it. And scholars still debate how much of courtly love poetry reflects genuine religious feeling woven into romance, and how much of it functioned as a kind of elegant, permissible disguise for desire that could not otherwise be spoken. There is a particular manuscript tradition worth pausing on here, because it reveals something genuinely surprising about how far this blending of sacred and romantic language could go. Several surviving love letters and poems from the 12th and 13th centuries use structural elements borrowed directly from psalms and liturgical prayer, the same rhythmic repetition, the same invocations of light and purity applied not to God but to a specific named woman. To a modern reader encountering these texts for the first time, the effect can feel almost startling, even faintly uncomfortable, because the line between worship and romantic longing appears to blur completely. One surviving fragment addresses its subject as a source of grace, whose gaze alone might lift a troubled soul towards salvation language that would not sound out of place in a hymn written instead for a woman the author had likely met only a handful of times. Was this genuine confusion between sacred and romantic feeling a symptom of a worldview where the two were simply never separated the way we separate them now? Or was it a deliberate literary strategy, a kind of camouflage sophisticated enough to let real desire hide in plain sight, protected by the untouchable language of faith? The evidence remains incomplete, and it likely varied from writer to writer, but either answer tells us something true about a society that took both love and sin seriously enough to require this much careful manoeuvring just to say I think of you. What makes this tradition even richer is the role played by professional poets and performers known as troubadours figures, who emerged primarily in the courts of southern France beginning in the 11th century, and whose influence spread across much of Western Europe in the centuries that followed. Nobles who lacked either the time or the literary skill to compose elaborate verse themselves would sometimes commission a troubadour to write on their behalf, describing the object of their affection in careful coded terms the troubadour had been trained to construct. This detail tends to surprise people because it complicates our usual image of a love-struck nobleman pouring his own heart onto parchment by candlelight. In many cases, the words a woman received, words she may have cherished and kept for years, were not written by the man who claimed them as his own feelings at all. They were composed by a hired professional, someone skilled in the specific art of expressing longing within acceptable boundaries in much the same way a family might commission a portrait rather than attempt to paint one themselves. This does not necessarily mean the underlying feeling was false. It simply means that even sincerity in this world often required expert translation to become something safe enough to send. Troubadours themselves occupied a curious and sometimes precarious position in medieval society. Many were of relatively modest birth, and their skill with the language and music offered them a rare kind of social mobility access to noble courts and wealthy patrons they might never have reached through birthright alone. Their songs, performed aloud rather than simply read, carried the additional emotional weight of music and voice, and surviving accounts suggest that a particularly skilled troubadour could hold an entire hall in complete silence, an audience of nobles and servants alike caught up together in verses about longing, separation and desire, dressed carefully in the language of virtue. It is worth pausing on the fact that these performances were rarely private. A woman's suitor might have his feelings, or a hired poet's version of them, performed aloud in front of her entire family, her rivals, her household staff. Whatever coded meaning the words carried had to survive that kind of public exposure, which helps explain why the coding needed to be so careful in the first place. A phrase too direct sung too plainly in front of the wrong audience could unravel months of careful courtship in a single evening. Women were not simply passive recipients within this tradition either, though their surviving voices are considerably harder to find in the historical record. A number of Trobaïrites female troubadours, writing primarily in the same southern French tradition, composed verses of their own, and what survives of their work often shows a notably more direct emotional register than the poetry composed by their male counterparts. Where men frequently hid behind religious metaphor and elaborate praise, several surviving verses attributed to women speak more plainly of longing, of frustration with their lover's absence, even in a few remarkable cases of open criticism toward a man who had failed to live up to his promises. This asymmetry raises an interesting question historians continue to sit with. Did women have somewhat more latitude to speak plainly within certain literary contexts? Perhaps because their poetry circulated more privately among smaller audiences of other women, rather than performed publicly the way male troubadour compositions often were. Or does the directness we see simply reflect a small unrepresentative sample of what has managed to survive across nearly 8 centuries? Most of it lost entirely to fire damp and the simple passage of time. We cannot know for certain, and it is worth resisting the temptation to build too confident a conclusion on so thin a foundation of surviving evidence. What ties all of this together? The borrowed language of scripture, the hired poets, the careful public performances is a single quietly moving truth that runs beneath the entire tradition. These were people living in a world that made almost every direct path to declaring love genuinely dangerous socially, spiritually, sometimes legally, and rather than abandon the attempt altogether, they built an entire elaborate architecture of metaphor and borrowed sanctity just to find a way through. There is something worth sitting with in that persistence. Every strange comparison to a saint, every borrowed rhythm from a psalm, every hired poet standing in for a man too nervous or unskilled to find his own words represents the same basic human impulse. We still recognize easily today the simple stubborn need to tell another person that they matter even when the world around you has made that nearly impossible to say out loud. But language, however carefully coded, was only ever half the equation, because a poem or a letter still had to physically travel from one hand to another, often across considerable distance carried by messengers who could be intercepted by roads that were far from safe, and by a postal system that in the strictest sense did not yet exist at all. What happened to these fragile, carefully coded declarations once they left a writer's hands, and what people did to protect them along the way, turns out to be a story with its own quiet strangeness still waiting to unfold. A letter once finished was never truly finished at all, because the words themselves were only the beginning of a much longer and more uncertain journey, one that could take days, sometimes weeks, and one that exposed every carefully chosen phrase to a level of risk the writer could rarely control once the parchment left their hands. Consider what sending a letter actually required in a world without a postal service in the modern sense. There was no single trusted system carrying private correspondence discreetly from one household to another. A letter meant for a woman 2 towns away had to be entrusted to a living person, a servant, a travelling merchant, occasionally a member of the clergy moving between parishes, someone willing to carry a folded, sealed piece of parchment across roads that were, in some large stretches of medieval Europe, genuinely unsafe. Bandits were a real concern on many trade routes. So were simple accidents, a messenger falling ill partway through the journey, a horse going lame, weather turning a passable road into an impassable one. A letter that survives today, tucked safely into an archive, represents only a fraction of what was actually written and sent. What survives of failed or lost correspondence is almost by definition far harder to trace, since a letter that never arrived rarely left behind any record of its own disappearance. This uncertainty shaped the letters themselves in ways that are easy to overlook, because a writer could never be entirely sure who might read a letter before its intended recipient did, whether through accident interception or simple curiosity on the part of a servant carrying it. Coded language was not merely a matter of romantic tradition, it was a genuine precaution. A letter that spoke too plainly of affection, if it fell into the wrong hands along the way, a rival suitor, a disapproving father, a servant loyal to a different household entirely could do serious damage before it ever reached the person it was written for. This is part of why the religious metaphor and careful indirection we sat with earlier was not simply an aesthetic choice. It was in a very real sense a form of protection built directly into the language designed to survive interception without giving away too much to an unintended reader. And then there is the matter of scent, something that tends to surprise people learning about this practice for the first time. Wealthier correspondents frequently infused their letters with fragrance before sending them, and this was not simply an act of romantic flourish. Cinnamon, one of the most commonly referenced scents in surviving correspondence and household accounts, carried a specific symbolic association with passion and warmth, while cloves were more often linked to devotion and steadfastness. A recipient opening a letter did not simply read the words on the page. They experienced the scent first often, before a single line had been unfolded, and that scent was understood at least among literate wealthier households, familiar with these conventions, to carry its own layer of meaning entirely separate from the text itself. Saffron, extraordinarily expensive and imported from considerable distances, occasionally appears in these scented letters as well, and its presence alone communicated something the words did not need to state directly: that the sender possessed real wealth and was willing to spend it simply to make an impression before a single sentence had been read. There is something worth pausing on here. because the practical reality of a multi-day journey by messenger complicates the romantic image considerably. A letter carefully scented with rose water or crushed violets, when it left the writer's hands, did not necessarily arrive smelling the same way it had at the start. Days spent inside a leather satchel exposed to rain, to the sweat of travel, to whatever else shared space with it along the road, meant that by the time many letters reached their destination, the original careful fragrance had often faded, mixed, or transformed into something considerably less elegant than intended. Historians studying surviving correspondence and household inventories have found occasional wry references to letters arriving smelling more of the journey than of the sentiment behind them, a small human detail that softens the otherwise polished image we tend to hold of medieval romantic ritual. Even the most carefully composed gesture, it turns out, was still subject to mud weather and the simple unpredictability of travel. Wax seals deserve their own moment of attention here as well, because they carried a weight of meaning that goes beyond simple closure. A seal pressed into warm wax, often bearing a family crest or a personal emblem, served a genuinely practical purpose, allowing a recipient to know immediately whether a letter had been opened and resealed along the way, a real concern given how many hands a letter might pass through before reaching its destination. But the seal also functioned as a kind of signature of intent, a mark that authenticated not just the sender's identity, but in the minds of many medieval readers, something closer to the sincerity of the message itself. Several surviving accounts describe seals scented with frankincense or myrrh for particularly significant correspondence substances carrying strong religious association, which tied the letter's authenticity back once again to the language of faith that shaped so much of medieval courtship. A broken or tampered seal discovered upon arrival was not a minor inconvenience. It could raise immediate and serious suspicion about who else might have read a private letter before its intended recipient ever did. This is where the true danger of letter writing begins to come into focus, because interception was not simply a theoretical risk discussed in conduct manuals. It happened, and when it did, the consequences could ripple outward, well beyond the two people who had written and received the letter in the first place. A family who discovered a daughter's private correspondence with the man they had not approved could act swiftly and decisively, sometimes ending a courtship immediately, sometimes accelerating a marriage arrangement with someone else entirely as a way of closing off the relationship before it could develop further. Scholars still debate how frequently this kind of discovery actually altered marriage outcomes across different regions and social classes, since surviving records tend to capture the aftermath. A sudden betrothal, a family dispute recorded in a court document far more often than they capture the intercepted letter itself, which by its nature was often destroyed or hidden once discovered. But the pattern that does survive, scattered across court records and family correspondence from several regions of medieval Europe, suggests strongly that a private letter, once it left a person's hands, was never entirely private again, and everyone writing one appears to have understood that risk, even if only instinctively. Is it any wonder, then, that so much medieval love poetry reads as cautious, layered, deliberately difficult to pin down to a single meaning? A letter was not a private whisper between two people, the way we might imagine a text message or a sealed modern envelope to be. It was a physical object that travelled through a world full of curious eyes, unreliable roads, and family structures with every incentive to intercept exactly this kind of correspondence before it could shape a young person's future in ways their elders had not sanctioned. Writing plainly was not simply a matter of social awkwardness or literary fashion. It was quite often a matter of protecting both the sender and the recipient from consequences that could follow them for years. And yet, despite every one of these obstacles, distance, danger, the very real possibility of discovery, people kept writing anyway, kept entrusting their most carefully chosen words to messengers and roads, and the uncertain mercy of time and weather. There is something quietly remarkable in that persistence, the same persistence we saw earlier in the borrowed language of scripture and the hired verses of professional poets. Love in this world was never simple to express, and it was rarely safe to express plainly. But it was apparently worth the risk again and again, letter after letter, seal after seal, regardless of how many of those letters never survived the journey at all. Not every risk taken in the name of love in this period, however, stayed confined to careful words and coded gestures. Some men, when they believed a woman's honour had been slighted, reached for something considerably less subtle than a scented letter or a borrowed verse, and what they reached for tended to draw blood. Honour in the medieval world was never simply a private feeling a man carried inside himself. It was a public asset, something that could rise or fall in value depending entirely on how others perceived it. And because a man's honour was so tightly bound to the women in his family, a wife, a sister, a daughter, an insult aimed at her, real or merely imagined, became an insult aimed directly at him. This is the foundation beneath one of the more unsettling customs to emerge from this period, the practice of duelling in a woman's name, often without her knowledge, sometimes without her consent, and occasionally over incidents so minor that they barely qualify as incidents at all. To understand how this worked, it helps to picture something as ordinary as a marketplace on a busy morning. A woman moves between stalls, perhaps glancing toward a merchant selling ribbon or fine thread, and a man nearby, a stranger to her, entirely happens to be standing in her line of sight when her gaze passes across him. Under the codes of conduct that govern noble behaviour in much of medieval and early chivalric Europe, that glance, however accidental, however brief, could be interpreted by an onlooker, a brother, a betrothed, a father, as a slight worth defending. Not because the woman had done anything at all, but because the mere possibility that her attention had wandered toward another man was enough to threaten the fragile, carefully maintained perception of her virtue, and by extension, the honour of the men responsible for guarding it. Historians examining surviving court records and chronicles from this period have found that a striking number of documented duels and violent confrontations trace back to disputes this small and exchanged look, a comment overheard second-hand, a rumour with no clear origin at all. What makes this custom especially strange to modern eyes is how little the woman herself typically factored into the actual resolution of the conflict. The chivalric code that shaped noble behaviour across much of Western Europe from roughly the 12th century onward placed enormous emphasis on a knight's duty to defend feminine honour. Yet that duty was almost entirely performative, addressed to other men rather than to the woman supposedly being protected. A duel fought in a woman's name rarely involved her input, her consent, or even, in some documented cases, her awareness that the confrontation was happening at all until it was already over. The fight was never really about her feelings or her safety. It was about restoring a man's standing among other men, using her reputation as the battlefield on which that standing was contested. Scholars still debate how consciously medieval society understood this dynamic at the time, whether it was recognised even then as a system more concerned with male hierarchy than female welfare, or whether the participants genuinely believed they were acting in service of protection and devotion. The truth likely sits somewhere uncomfortable between the too sincere belief tangled together with a structure that primarily served male status. The mechanics of these confrontations varied considerably, depending on region, era, and social rank. At the more formalised end, particularly among nobility, a challenge might involve the ritual act of throwing down a glove or gauntlet, a gesture that survives in modern language even now, long after its original violent context has faded from common memory. This formal challenge could lead to an arranged duel, sometimes fought on horseback with lances in a manner resembling a tournament joust, sometimes on foot with swords, occasionally overseen by referees and witnessed by an audience that had gathered specifically to watch. These sanctioned confrontations followed rules however brutal, and were understood within noble society as a legitimate, even honourable way to settle a dispute. Further down the social ladder among merchants, craftsmen and common labourers, the same underlying impulse expressed itself with considerably less ceremony. A spontaneous brawl breaking out in a tavern or village square, often ending not in careful ritual but in genuine injury, sometimes death, with far less structure and far fewer witnesses willing or able to record what had actually happened. There is a detail worth sitting with here that rarely makes it into popular retellings of chivalric romance. The goal of these confrontations was not always or even usually to kill an opponent outright. In many documented cases, the objective appears to have been demonstration rather than destruction, a public display of willingness to risk harm on behalf of a woman's honour, which functioned as proof of devotion in a society that valued visible sacrifice over private feeling. A man who drew his sword and fought even if he lost, even if he walked away wounded rather than victorious, had still demonstrated something the surrounding community recognised as valuable, that he was willing to bleed for what he claimed to protect. This helps explain why so many of these confrontations, brutal as they were, rarely escalated into the kind of sustained lethal violence we might expect. The point more often than not was the gesture itself, not the outcome, and yet the cost of that gesture was still very real. Surviving parish and coroner records from several regions of medieval England document injuries and occasional deaths resulting from disputes explicitly tied to a woman's reputation or a perceived slight against her honour, and these records offer a sobering counterweight to the more romanticised image of chivalric devotion that survives in poetry and legend. A man might lose an eye, a hand, the full use of a limb over an incident that, examined honestly, likely involved no wrongdoing on anyone's part at all, simply the unfortunate convergence of an ordinary glance and a system primed to interpret it as provocation. What did the women at the centre of these disputes actually feel, watching men fight over incidents they themselves had not caused and often had little power to stop? The evidence remains frustratingly thin here, since the voices that survive from this period skew heavily toward male chroniclers and court record keepers. But the fragments that do exist, a handful of surviving letters, occasional marginalia in convent records, suggest a range of reactions from genuine distress to something closer to weary resignation. Women who understood, even if they could not change it, that their reputation had become a kind of currency spent by men on their behalf. Some women, according to a small number of surviving accounts, attempted to diffuse these situations before they could escalate at all, claiming poor eyesight or simple distraction, rather than allow an accidental glance to be read as invitation. Whether these strategies were common or simply memorable enough to survive in the historical record is difficult to say with confidence, but their existence suggests that at least some women were keenly aware of the danger their own presence in public spaces could unintentionally trigger, and took active, deliberate steps to manage a risk they had never chosen to create in the first place. What emerges from all of this is a portrait considerably more complicated than the simple image of chivalry as pure romantic devotion. Underneath the poetry, the thrown glove, the formal ritual of the duel, sat a system built primarily to manage and display male status, one that used a woman's reputation as its instrument, while offering her remarkably little genuine protection or voice within it. The blood spilled in these confrontations was real. So were the injuries, the occasional deaths. The fear that must have accompanied women who understood, however dimly, how easily an innocent moment could spiral into violence entirely outside their control. But duelling was not the only place where fear and love intertwined in dangerous ways during this period. In certain corners of medieval society, a different kind of accusation carried consequences even more severe than a sword fight, one aimed almost exclusively at women, and one that could end not in a wound, but in a trial from which there was often no real chance of escape. Return for a moment to that young woman standing outside the churchyard wall, the one we sat with at the very beginning of tonight's story, her small pouch of rosemary and rue pressed flat against her sleeve. Her case was not an isolated cruelty, a single unlucky misunderstanding in an otherwise gentle world. It belonged to a much larger and far more troubling pattern, one that reveals something uncomfortable about how medieval society handled the gap between desire and control. To understand why something as ordinary as herbs could become a matter of life and death, it helps to sit with how thoroughly the boundary between medicine folk tradition and what authorities called witchcraft blurred in the medieval mind. For most of the period there was no clean separation between a wise woman offering a remedy for fever and a wise woman offering a remedy for a wandering husband's affection. Both practices drew from the same body of inherited knowledge, passed down through generations of mothers and grandmothers, involving herbs, small rituals, whispered, words spoken with intention, a charm meant to soothe a colicky infant, and a charm meant to draw a reluctant suitor's eye might use nearly identical language and nearly identical ingredients. What separated an accepted household remedy from a dangerous accusation was almost never the practice itself. It was who was watching and how that watcher chose to interpret what they saw. This becomes especially clear when we look at how church authorities across different regions of medieval Europe actually treated love magic in their own writings and legal codes. Several surviving penitential manuals texts used by priests to guide confession and assign appropriate penance address the practice of love charms directly, and what they reveal is more nuanced than the image of witch trials that tends to dominate popular imagination. In many cases, a woman confessing to using an herb or a whispered charm to attract a man's affection was assigned a relatively modest penance: days of fasting. A set number of prayers treated as a minor sin of vanity or misplaced faith, rather than as evidence of dealing with dark forces. Scholars still debate how consistently this more lenient approach held across different regions and centuries, since enforcement varied enormously depending on local clergy, regional custom, and the broader political and religious climate of a given moment. But the existence of these more measured responses complicates the popular image of medieval Europe as uniformly quick to burn any woman suspected of magical practice. For long stretches of the medieval period in many places, the reality was closer to quiet correction than public execution. What changed, and changed dramatically, was the late medieval period, particularly from the 14th century onward, when a shift in theological thinking began to reframe folk magic not as simple superstition or minor sin, but as evidence of a genuine pact with the devil. This shift did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not happen evenly. It emerged gradually, shaped by a combination of theological writing, political anxiety, and in some documented cases simple opportunism, family disputes or property conflicts dressed up in the language of witchcraft to settle scores that had little to do with magic at all. A woman accused of using a love charm in the 12th century might face a private conversation with her priest and a handful of prescribed prayers. A woman making the same accusation in the 15th century in certain regions under the influence of this harder theological turn could find herself facing formal interrogation, and in the most severe documented cases, execution. The story of the young woman we met earlier sits somewhere within this shifting landscape, and it is worth being honest about what the historical record can and cannot tell us with certainty. Cases involving accusations of love magic, specifically as opposed to broader witchcraft accusations involving alleged harm to crops, livestock, or health, appear less frequently in surviving court records than the more dramatic accusations that dominate popular memory of witch trials. This does not mean such cases were rare in lived experience. It more likely reflects which records survived, which trials were considered significant enough to document at length, and which communities had the literacy and institutional structure to preserve detailed accounts at all. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete here, and historians examining this narrower category of accusation caution against assuming we have anything close to a full picture of how often love charms specifically triggered formal prosecution across the full span of medieval Europe. What we do have in the surviving fragments are individual cases detailed enough to offer a real sense of what such an accusation actually meant for the woman living through it. In several documented trials from the later medieval and early modern transition period, women accused of using herbs or charms to attract a specific man's affection describe in testimony, recorded by court scribes, practices that sound remarkably ordinary by the standards of folk tradition. Rosemary worn close to the skin, a chant recited over bread water drawn from a particular well at a particular hour believed to hold special properties. These were not in the minds of the women performing them acts of malevolent magic. They were closer to what we might today call folk psychology or ritual hope. Small acts meant to steady the practitioner's own nerve, and perhaps in some private, half-acknowledged way to nudge fate slightly in a favoured direction. Is it any wonder frightened, hopeful young woman reached for the same tools her mother and grandmother had used before her, without fully understanding how differently those same tools might be read by a suspicious neighbour or an anxious clergyman? The men accused of being bewitched into affection tell an equally revealing story, though from an entirely different angle. A number of surviving cases involve a nobleman or a man of some local standing claiming, sometimes years after the fact, that his own attraction to a particular woman had not been genuine at all, but the product of enchantment, a claim that conveniently absolved him of responsibility for a relationship or a marriage that had since become inconvenient, embarrassing, or politically costly. Historians examining this pattern have noted with a certain dry weariness how frequently the accusation of bewitchment surfaces, specifically when a man wishes to extract himself from an attachment he no longer wants to acknowledge as his own choice. Blaming the herbs, blaming a whispered charm, blaming the woman herself for supposedly manipulating forces beyond her control, offered a convenient explanation that shifted responsibility entirely away from the man's own desire and onto the woman who had in most documented cases done little more than hope he might notice her. This dynamic reveals something important sitting beneath the surface of these trials, something that complicates any simple reading of them as purely religious panic. Accusations of love magic were rarely just about theology or genuine fear of supernatural harm. They were also quite often about control, about who was permitted to want, who was permitted to act on that wanting, and who bore the consequences when desire crossed lines that family, church, or social hierarchy had drawn. A woman using a charm to attract a man's attention was, in a very real sense, attempting to exercise agency in a system that offered her remarkably little of it elsewhere, and the severity with which that small act of agency could be punished tells us a great deal about how threatening even modest female initiative could appear within this world. It would be a mistake, though, to leave this part of the story only in the register of fear and punishment, because the record also preserves something quieter and more resilient underneath the trials and the accusations. Even in regions and periods where suspicion ran highest, folk practices around love and attraction never fully disappeared. They persisted in villages passed quietly from woman to woman, adapted and disguised when necessary, surviving in the gaps between what authorities could see and what ordinary people continued to practice in the privacy of their own homes. The impulse to seek some small measure of control over an uncertain heart, to believe that a whispered word or a carefully chosen herb might tip fate however slightly in a hopeful direction, proved remarkably difficult to extinguish even under the threat of formal accusation. What the young woman by the churchyard wall did not know, standing there with her pouch of rosemary and rue, was how much her fate would depend not on what she had actually done, but on the particular temperament of the priest who heard about it. The particular political and theological climate of her specific region and decade, and the particular mood of a court that would decide almost arbitrarily by the standards we might wish for today, whether her small private hope deserved forgiveness or condemnation. That uncertainty more than anything else may be the truest and most unsettling fact at the centre of this entire chapter of history, and it sets the stage for understanding just how much of a person's fate in matters of love was never really left to love at all, but to forces of law, faith and family that stood watching ready to judge long before two hearts were ever given the chance to decide anything for themselves. Long before a court decided whether a woman's charm was harmless hope or something darker, another authority had often already weighed in on her fate, one that operated not from a pulpit or a judge's bench, but from careful calculations made against the movement of the night scale. Astrology occupied a position in medieval intellectual life that surprises people who assume it belonged only to the fringes of superstition, the province of fortune-tellers and village mystics. In truth, for much of the medieval period, astrology was treated as a legitimate branch of natural philosophy, studied alongside medicine and mathematics in the same universities that trained physicians and clergy. A physician examining a patient was often expected to consult the position of the planets before recommending treatment, since the movement of celestial bodies was believed to directly influence the balance of humours within the human body. The same humoral framework we touched on earlier when considering scent and its supposed effect on temperament. If the stars could influence health, appetite and mood, it followed naturally, at least within this worldview, that they could influence something as delicate and consequential as romantic attraction as well. Several surviving astrological manuals from the 13th and 14th centuries devote considerable attention specifically to matters of courtship and marriage, offering guidance on which lunar phases favoured a proposal, which planetary alignments warned against beginning a new attachment, and which combinations of birth charts suggested genuine compatibility between two people being considered for marriage. This last practice, comparing birth charts before finalising a match, was taken seriously enough among wealthier and noble families that court astrologers were sometimes consulted formally as part of marriage negotiations, their assessment carrying real weight alongside more practical considerations like land dowry and family alliance. A recorded case from a 14th century noble household describes a proposed marriage being delayed for several months specifically because the family's astrologer advised that the current planetary configuration was unfavourable for the union, and that waiting for a more auspicious alignment would improve the couple's prospects for a harmonious and fertile marriage. Scholars still debate how much genuine belief drove decisions like this versus how often astrology served as a convenient, face-saving justification for delays that had more mundane causes. A dowry not yet fully assembled, a political situation still unsettled a family, quietly reconsidering the match for reasons they preferred not to state outright. The astrological explanation offered a graceful way to postpone without giving offence, and it is entirely possible that both genuine belief and practical convenience operated together in many of these documented cases. The waxing and waning moon held particular significance within this framework, and the underlying logic once explained feels almost intuitive even to modern ears unfamiliar with medieval astrology. A waxing moon growing steadily toward fullness was associated with growth expansion and favourable new beginnings, making it considered an ideal time to confess feelings, to send a letter of courtship, or to formally propose marriage. A waning moon shrinking night by night toward darkness carried the opposite association, decline diminishment endings rather than beginnings. Several surviving conduct manuals explicitly advise against beginning any significant new venture, romantic or otherwise, during this waning period, warning that whatever was started under a shrinking moon would itself be prone to shrinking and fading over time. A rejected suitor who had confessed his feelings during what he later learned was a waning lunar phase might find some measure of comfort, however strange it sounds to us now in believing that the timing itself, rather than any genuine incompatibility or personal failing, bore responsibility for his disappointment. There is something worth sitting with in that. Astrology in this context functioned not only as a predictive tool, but as a kind of emotional cushion, a way of processing rejection or hardship without having to place the blame entirely on oneself. Full moons and eclipses carried their own specific warnings, within this tradition generally understood to intensify emotion beyond what could be safely trusted or acted upon. A proposal made during a full moon, several manuals caution risked being driven by heightened temporary passion rather than genuine lasting affection, the kind of intensity that might feel overwhelming and real in the moment but prove unstable once the particular lunar influence had passed. Eclipses were treated with even greater caution associated across multiple surviving astrological texts with disruption, misfortune, and events unfolding in ways contrary to a person's intention. A courtship or proposal timed poorly against an eclipse was believed capable of inviting consequences considerably beyond simple romantic disappointment, sometimes framed in terms of broader misfortune touching a person's health, their family's fortune, or their standing in the community. Whether ordinary people genuinely organized their romantic decisions around these celestial warnings with the same rigor, wealthy, educated households did remain genuinely uncertain. The evidence that survives skews heavily toward literate households, wealthy enough to employ or consult a trained astrologer, and what practices existed among common people who would have had access to lunar phases and general folk astrology, but rarely to detailed birth chart calculations, is far harder to reconstruct with any real confidence. What makes this astrological framework particularly interesting is how it intersected sometimes uneasily with the Church's own teachings about fate, free will, and divine providence. Official Church doctrine held that human beings possessed free will granted by God and that a person's choices, including choices about love and marriage, belonged to them and to divine guidance rather than to the mechanical influence of planets and stars. Several church councils across the medieval period issued formal statements cautioning against excessive reliance on astrology, warning that it risked undermining a proper understanding of God's sovereignty over human affairs. And yet astrology continued to be practiced, studied, and consulted throughout the medieval period, often by the very clergy and religious institutions that issued these cautions, a contradiction that reveals something true about how medieval people actually navigated competing systems of belief, rather than adhering to any single one with perfect consistency. A monk copying astrological manuscripts by day might genuinely believe in free will and divine providence, while also genuinely believing that the timing of a proposal mattered, that certain hours and certain lunar phases carried real influence over human affairs, holding both convictions simultaneously without apparently experiencing them as contradictory in the way we might expect looking back with modern eyes. There is a particular category of evidence worth pausing on here, because it offers a rare, more intimate glimpse into how ordinary individuals actually used astrological reasoning in their private romantic lives beyond the formal marriage negotiations of noble households. A handful of surviving personal letters and diary fragments from merchants and lesser gentry people literate enough to leave behind written records, but not wealthy enough to command a dedicated court astrologer, reference consulting almanacs, the widely circulated printed calendars that included basic astrological guidance alongside dates for planting crops and observing religious feast days before making decisions about courtship. One such surviving fragment, attributed to a merchant's son writing sometime in the 14th century, describes waiting several additional days before sending a letter of affection, specifically because an almanac he consulted indicated an unfavourable alignment during the days he'd originally intended to write. Is it not remarkable in a strange way that a young man clearly eager to express his feelings would nonetheless delay that expression, based on nothing more than a printed calendar's interpretation of the night sky? It suggests a world where waiting itself, patience guided by belief in cosmic timing, was understood as a genuine act of care rather than simple hesitation or anxiety. This intersection of astrology and courtship also reveals something quietly practical beneath its mystical surface, something that historians examining this period have increasingly come to appreciate. Encouraging a person to wait for a more favourable moment before confessing feelings, or making a proposal regardless of whether the underlying astrological reasoning held any real predictive power, likely served a genuinely useful social function. It built in a period of reflection before an emotionally significant and often irreversible decision, a kind of built-in pause that may have prevented at least some hasty declarations or poorly considered unions. Whether medieval people consciously understood astrology as serving this practical psychological purpose or genuinely believed in its literal predictive power, without any awareness of the more mundane benefit it provided, the evidence remains incomplete and likely varied considerably from person to person. What survives suggests both were probably true simultaneously for many individuals. Genuine belief and practical benefit intertwined in a way that is difficult and perhaps unnecessary to fully untangle from this distance. Not every reference to astrology within courtship carried this gentle, patient quality, however. Several surviving court records document individuals using astrological claims for considerably less noble purposes, much like the men we encountered earlier, who blamed love charms to excuse an inconvenient attraction. A nobleman seeking to delay or avoid an unwanted betrothal arranged by his family could invoke unfavourable planetary alignment as a face-saving reason for postponement, one considerably more diplomatic than admitting outright reluctance or personal objection to the match itself. The language of the stars in these cases functioned less as genuine belief and more as a socially acceptable vocabulary for expressing hesitation that could not otherwise be voiced without causing real offence to a family whose alliance still mattered a great deal. There is something almost familiar in that particular kind of dishonesty, the polite excuse reached for not out of genuine conviction but out of social necessity, a pattern of human behaviour that feels far less distant from our own era than the elaborate language of moons and planets might initially suggest. By the time we reached the later medieval period, astrology had woven itself so thoroughly into the fabric of courtship, marriage, negotiation, and personal decision-making that it becomes almost impossible to separate genuine cosmological belief from social custom, practical convenience, and inherited habit passed down without much conscious examination at all. What began as serious natural philosophy studied alongside medicine in university halls had trickled down through printed almanacs into the daily decisions of merchants and minor gentry deciding when to send a letter, and had shaped in documented cases the formal timing of noble marriages meant to secure land and lineage for generations to come. The stars in this world were never simply distant lights to admire on a clear night. They were understood as active participants in the most intimate decisions a person could make, watched, calculated, and consulted with the same seriousness a modern person might bring to any major life decision requiring careful thought before action. And this careful, deliberate weighing of timing and consequence, it turns out, was not confined only to the stars overhead. Down on the ground, families were engaged in their own elaborate calculations, weighing fortune and consequence with an entirely different kind of instrument, one that had far less to do with planetary alignment and far more to do with land coin and the delicate, often unforgiving arithmetic of who was permitted to marry whom at all. For most people living through the medieval period, the entire elaborate architecture we have spent this evening exploring, the careful glances, the scented letters, The astrological timing existed alongside a far more blunt and unromantic reality, one that historians continue to argue about with genuine intensity even now. Because for the majority of medieval marriages, particularly among the nobility, and increasingly among the merchant classes as commerce grew more central to European life, love was never really the point of the union at all. Marriage in this world functioned primarily as an economic and political instrument, a way of consolidating land, securing alliances between families, transferring wealth, and producing legitimate heirs to continue that transfer into the next generation. Among noble households, a daughter's marriage was frequently negotiated, while she was still a child, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, with the actual union not taking place until years later, once both parties reached an age considered appropriate, but the terms themselves settled long before either young person had any meaningful say in the matter. Contracts survive from across medieval Europe detailing these negotiations with the same careful, unsentimental precision a modern reader might expect from a business agreement, because in nearly every meaningful sense that is exactly what they were. Land was specified. Dowries were itemized, sometimes down to individual pieces of livestock or specific parcels of farmland. Contingencies were written in for what would happen to the arrangement should one party die before the marriage could be finalized, or should a more advantageous match present itself before the wedding day arrived. This raises an uncomfortable question that historians examining this period have wrestled with for generations, one worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past. If marriage was so thoroughly a transaction arranged by parents and negotiated like property, did genuine romantic love have any real place within it at all? Or was the entire courtly tradition we have explored tonight, the poetry, the coded glances, the careful gifts, something that existed almost entirely separate from actual marriage, a kind of parallel emotional life that rarely intersected with the practical business of who married whom? The honest answer, based on what survives in the historical record, is more complicated than either extreme suggests, and scholars still debate exactly where the balance actually fell. Some historians argue persuasively that courtly love as it appears in surviving poetry and conduct manuals was never really meant to describe marital affection at all, but rather described a separate, often idealized, sometimes explicitly extramarital longing, the yearning of a knight for a married noblewoman he could never actually possess, precisely because that impossibility was part of what made the emotion so intensely felt and so worth writing about. Under this reading, courtly love functioned almost as a kind of emotional theatre, a socially sanctioned space for experiencing and expressing longing that had little practical connection to the actual mechanics of who married whom for land and lineage. The two systems, romantic longing and practical marriage, operated side by side without much genuine overlap, each serving a different function within medieval life. Other historians push back against this interpretation, pointing to a considerable body of surviving personal correspondence between actual married couples that suggests real affection did develop within many arranged unions, sometimes quite deeply, even if that affection was never the reason the marriage had been arranged in the first place. Several surviving letters between noble husbands and wives written years into already established marriages use language of genuine warmth, concern, and attachment that reads as difficult to dismiss as purely formal or performative. A merchant's letter to his wife, written while travelling on business in the 14th century, expresses what appears to be authentic longing for her company and worry over her health during his absence language. That would be strange to include in a private letter never meant for outside eyes if the underlying feeling were entirely absent. What these surviving fragments suggest taken together is that arranged marriage and genuine affection were never necessarily incompatible, even if affection was rarely the starting point. Two people brought together initially for reasons having nothing to do with personal feeling could, and evidently often did develop real attachment to one another over years of shared life, shared children, and shared hardship. The same way affection can grow between people brought together by circumstance, rather than initial choice in almost any era of human history. There is a particularly striking detail that emerges from marriage negotiation records worth pausing on here, because it complicates the simple image of arranged marriage as purely cold and transactional. Several surviving contracts, particularly from merchant and lesser gentry families rather than the highest nobility, include clauses allowing a proposed match to be called off if either young person expressed strong sustained objection once they were old enough to voice one, suggesting that at least some families, even within a fundamentally transactional system, retained some concern for whether the two people involved could reasonably tolerate, if not necessarily love one another. This detail does not overturn the broader reality that most young people, particularly young women, had limited genuine power to refuse a match their family had arranged. But it does suggest a spectrum existed, ranging from families who treated a daughter's preferences as entirely irrelevant to the negotiation to families who, while still ultimately making the final decision themselves, at least sought some measure of her willingness before finalizing an arrangement that would shape the rest of her life. Class played a considerable role in how much room genuine choice actually occupied within this system, and this is a distinction that tends to get flattened in popular retellings of medieval marriage that focus almost exclusively on nobility. Among common labourers and peasant families where there was often little significant land or wealth at stake in a marriage, the practical necessity of arranging a strategically advantageous union simply mattered less, and surviving parish records from several regions of medieval England suggest that ordinary people frequently had considerably more latitude to choose their own spouse than their noble counterparts, precisely because there was less at stake in the choice from a purely economic standpoint. A young farmhand and a young dairymaid working on neighbouring holdings might genuinely court one another. In the more informal sense we explored earlier, glances exchanged during shared labour, small gestures of interest developed over shared tasks with far less family intervention than a noble daughter would ever experience. This does not mean peasant marriage was somehow free of practical consideration. Entirely, families still weighed a potential spouse's work capacity, their family's reputation in the community, their likely ability to contribute to a shared household, but the scale of what was being negotiated, and therefore the intensity of family control over the outcome, was considerably reduced compared to the elaborate contracts governing noble unions. The Church's own position on marriage adds yet another layer of genuine complexity to this picture, one that occasionally worked in favour of the individuals involved rather than against them. Canon law, as we touched on earlier, technically required the free consent of both parties for a marriage to be considered valid in the eyes of the Church, a doctrine that existed in real, if often uncomfortable, tension with the practical reality of arranged matches negotiated by families with little input from the young people themselves. This tension occasionally produced genuine legal drama. A small number of surviving church court cases document young people, more often young women than young men, formally challenging a marriage their family had arranged, arguing before an ecclesiastical court that they had never genuinely consented to the union, and that it should therefore be declared invalid under canon law. These cases were rare, and the odds of success were far from guaranteed, since challenging a family's authority in this way required considerable courage and often came at real social cost regardless of the legal outcome. But their existence, however infrequent, reveals a more the tension between family authority and individual consent was not simply theoretical within medieval society. It was on occasion actively contested in formal legal settings by young people unwilling to accept a match imposed on them entirely without their genuine agreement. What survives from all of this taken together resists any single tidy conclusion, and perhaps that resistance is itself the most honest thing this part of the story can offer. Medieval marriage was not universally loveless, nor was it universally romantic in the way courtly poetry might suggest. It existed somewhere in the considerable space between those two extremes shaped by class, by region, by individual family temperament, by the specific personalities of the two people eventually bound together, sometimes for genuine decades within a system that had rarely asked either of them what they actually wanted at the outset. Real affection grew in many of these unions, documented in letters too intimate to have been written for any audience beyond the person they were addressed to. Real suffering existed in others' marriages that remained by every surviving account cold and distant for their entire duration. Two people sharing a household and little else across a lifetime neither had chosen. And for the families standing behind these arrangements, the fathers and mothers negotiating contracts on behalf of children, sometimes barely old enough to understand what was being decided for them. The calculations extended far beyond any single wedding day. What a family agreed to and what they refused could shape their fortunes, their alliances, and their standing within their community for generations to come, which meant that saying no to a proposed match, however sincerely a young person might have wished for a different outcome, was rarely a simple or a safe thing for a family to do. A refusal once spoken rarely stayed contained to the two people most affected by it. When a father said no to a proposed match, or worse, when he said yes to one, his daughter desperately did not want the consequences rippled outward through an entire household, and sometimes through an entire community in ways that reveal just how little personal happiness factored into the actual machinery, deciding who would spend their life with whom. To understand why a father's decision carried such total authority, it helps to sit with what marriage actually represented at the level of household economics in this period. A daughter was in the coldest and most literal sense. The surviving legal records allow us to see a kind of asset whose value could be realized through strategic placement into another family. Her dowry, the moneyland livestock or goods her family provided upon her marriage, represented a significant financial investment often accumulated over years, specifically for this purpose, and the family receiving that dowry gained not just a daughter-in-law, but tangible wealth transferred directly into their own household. A father negotiating his daughter's marriage was in effect negotiating the terms of a substantial financial transaction, one that would shape his family's economic position, its alliances, and its standing in the surrounding community for years, sometimes generations to come. Refusing a proposed match or insisting on one his daughter opposed was never simply a matter of romantic preference weighed against paternal stubbornness. It was a decision with real, lasting financial consequences that extended well beyond the two individuals actually being married. This helps explain why so many surviving legal and family records from the period document fathers pursuing marriages. Their daughters actively resisted, sometimes for years, with a persistence that can feel genuinely difficult to read from a modern vantage point. Several surviving church court cases from 14th century England detail young women formally petitioning ecclesiastical courts, arguing that a marriage arranged by their father should be declared invalid because they had never given genuine consent a legal avenue that existed, as we touched on earlier, because canon law technically required consent for a valid marriage regardless of family pressure. What these surviving cases reveal when examined closely is a system under real internal tension, one where church doctrine on individual consent existed in genuine, sometimes actively litigated conflict with the practical authority fathers held over their households and their daughters' futures. A young woman bringing such a case to court needed considerable resolve, since doing so meant publicly defying her own father in a society that placed enormous weight on filial obedience, and doing so with no guarantee whatsoever that the ecclesiastical court would ultimately rule in her favour. One particularly well-documented case drawn from surviving court records in the Diocese of York involves a young woman identified in the surviving documentation only by her given name, who petitioned the church court arguing that she had been coerced into a betrothal through what the record describes as sustained pressure and threat of physical punishment from her father over a period of several months. The court's eventual ruling, preserved in the surviving record, ultimately sided with the young woman, declaring the betrothal invalid on the grounds that genuine consent, a requirement under canon law, had not actually been present at the time the agreement was made. This outcome matters because it demonstrates that the system was not entirely without recourse for a young person determined enough and often desperate enough to pursue it through every available channel. But it is worth being honest about how exceptional this kind of successful outcome likely was. Historians examining the broader pattern of surviving church court records caution that we cannot know with confidence how many similar cases ended differently quietly, without ever reaching formal court proceedings at all, simply because most young women lacked either the knowledge that such legal recourse existed, or the practical means, financial and social, to pursue it against a father's direct wishes. What happened to daughters who lacked the resources, the knowledge, or the sheer nerve required to formally challenge a marriage they opposed tends to leave a much fainter trace in the historical record, precisely because silent compliance rarely generates the kind of formal document that survives for historians to later examine. This absence itself deserves attention because it likely represents the far more common experience. A young woman who accepted a marriage she did not want, who spent decades in a household bound to a man she had never chosen, and perhaps never came to love, left behind. No petition, no court record, no formal complaint for later generations to discover. Her experience survives, if it survives at all, only in occasional fragments, a brief mention in a family letter describing a daughter's evident unhappiness, a physician's account noting symptoms that read to modernize at least as what we might now recognize as depression or profound emotional distress, though. Applying that modern framework to a medieval person's inner experience requires real caution, given how differently that period understood emotional and mental suffering. What survives suggests that this quieter, more common experience of resigned or coerced compliance likely far outnumbered the dramatic court challenges that happen to have left behind detailed legal records for us to study now. Sons faced pressures of their own within this system, though the specific shape of that pressure looked considerably different from what daughters experienced, and this distinction is worth sitting with because it complicates any assumption that fathers held authority only over their female children. A son, particularly an eldest son who stood to inherit his family's primary land and title, carried enormous responsibility for securing a marriage that would strengthen rather than diminish his family's position. Several surviving family correspondence collections from noble households document fathers pressuring sons toward advantageous matches with the same intensity directed toward daughters, though the specific vocabulary used tends to differ in revealing ways. Where pressure on daughters in surviving letters often centers on obedience and duty, pressure on sons more frequently invokes language of legacy, responsibility to ancestors, and the weight of continuing a family line, a framing that placed the burden differently, but with no less real consequence for a young man who might have genuinely preferred a different match or no immediate match at all. There is a particular category of surviving evidence worth pausing on here, because it reveals something genuinely surprising about how families sometimes handled a child's sustained resistance to an arranged match, a middle path that popular imagination tends to overlook in favor of the more dramatic binary of either total obedience or outright rebellion. Several surviving family account books and correspondence collections document what appears to have been a common practical compromise, a lengthy engagement period sometimes stretching several years beyond what was strictly necessary for a practical preparation, during which a reluctant son or daughter was given time quietly and without formal acknowledgement that resistance was even occurring to grow accustomed to the idea of the match, to develop at least some familiarity and tolerance for their intended spouse before the marriage was actually finalized. Scholars examining this pattern suggest it may represent a genuine, if unofficial, acknowledgement among at least some families that forcing an immediate union onto a deeply unwilling child carried real risks not only to the young person's well-being, but to the eventual stability and success of the marriage itself, a stability that mattered considerably to a family's long-term interests. Is it not worth considering that even within a system with so little formal regard for personal preference, some families found quiet practical ways to soften its harder edges, not necessarily out of pure compassion, but because a genuinely miserable, unstable marriage served no family's long-term interests either. The consequences of outright refusal when a young person's resistance proved impossible to overcome through patience or delay could be severe, and the historical record preserves several documented cases worth sitting with, honestly rather than softening for comfort. A small number of surviving accounts describe daughters who refused an arranged match being sent to live in a convent, sometimes against their own wishes for that path either, a solution that removed the immediate problem of resistance from the household, while technically avoiding the sin of forcing an unwilling marriage, since canon law's consent requirement applied specifically to marriage rather than to religious life, which fell under different rules entirely regarding a family's authority over a daughter's placement. This detail complicates the convent's popular image as a place of spiritual calling and genuine devotion. For at least some women documented in surviving records, the convent functioned less as a chosen vocation and more as a family's alternative solution to an unresolved conflict over marriage, a permanent removal from the marriage market entirely rather than any resolution of what the young woman herself might have actually wanted for her own life. Other documented consequences appear considerably harsher still. Surviving court records and chronicles from several regions describe instances of daughters disinherited entirely for refusing a proposed match, or in a smaller number of cases for pursuing a match their family had explicitly forbidden, a punishment that carried consequences extending far beyond the immediate emotional pain of family conflict. Disinheritance in this period meant genuine, lasting economic precarity, the loss of the dowry that would otherwise have provided some measure of financial security within marriage, and in many documented cases a complete severing of the social and economic support network and a family represented in a world with essentially no alternative safety net available to most people. A young woman who defied her family's wishes and married for love against explicit paternal objection might have gained the husband she wanted, but she frequently paid for that choice with the level of financial insecurity that shaped the entire remainder of her life, a trade that the surviving evidence suggests not every couple who made it ultimately found worthwhile, regardless of how genuine their initial affection for one another had been. What emerges from all of this, taken together across the surviving court records, family letters and account books that historians have spent considerable effort piecing together, is a picture of childhood and young adulthood, shaped almost entirely by decisions made on a young person's behalf. Decisions weighed against economic advantage, family alliance, and inherited social position, with a young person's own preference treated at best as one small factor among many considerably weightier considerations, and at worst as barely relevant at all. This was not universally true in every household across every region of medieval Europe, and the evidence does suggest genuine variation: families who listened, families who compromised through patient delay, families who genuinely cared about their children's eventual contentment even while ultimately making the final decision themselves. But the overwhelming pattern that survives points toward a world where a father's authority over his children's marriages was treated as close to absolute, softened only occasionally and only ever at the family's own discretion, rather than as any genuine right the young person themselves could reliably claim. What this meant in practice for the countless individuals who lived through arrangements they had little power to shape is a question the surviving evidence can only partially answer, since so much of what mattered most, the quiet grief of a daughter married against her wishes, the private resignation of a son who set aside his own preference for the sake of family legacy, left behind no formal document for later generations to recover. What does survive, scattered across contracts and court petitions and the rare precious personal letter that happened to escape the passage of centuries, is enough to tell us that this system, for all its careful economic logic and genuine occasional compassion, extracted a real and often silent human cost paid quietly generation after generation by people whose names rarely made it into any record at all. And yet even within a system this thoroughly weighted against individual choice, something of these people's actual lives, their small resistances, their quiet compromises, their occasional genuine victories still managed to leave a mark. Faint traces that continue to surface even now, centuries later in the walls of cathedrals, the margins of old ledgers and the customs that in altered and softened form still shape how people today think about what a wedding is even meant to represent. Walk through nearly any European city with old bones today and traces of everything we have spent this evening sitting with are still quietly visible if you know where to look for them embedded in customs so familiar now that most people never pause to wonder where they actually came from. Consider something as small and ordinary as the modern wedding ring worn without much thought by millions of people who have never once connected it to the world we have explored tonight. The specific placement of that ring on the fourth finger of the left hand traces back through centuries of medieval belief to an idea rooted in classical anatomy that persisted well into the medieval period, the notion that a particular vein, sometimes referred to in surviving medical texts as the vena amoris, ran directly from that finger to the heart, making it the natural and most meaningful location for a symbol meant to represent a binding emotional connection. Medieval physicians, drawing on inherited classical medical knowledge that we now know to be anatomically incorrect, genuinely believed this vein existed as a direct physical pathway between hand and heart, and that belief shaped a custom so thoroughly that it survived the eventual medical correction of the underlying anatomy by many centuries, continuing to shape wedding practices long after anyone still believed in the vein itself. It is a small, almost tender example of how deeply the physical and emotional intertwined in medieval thinking about love, expressed here not in producing false claims, but in leaving behind a custom that outlived the belief that had originally created it. The exchange of rings itself carries deeper roots, still connecting back to the practical, transactional nature of medieval marriage. We sat with earlier this evening. Several surviving marriage contracts from across medieval Europe describe rings functioning not primarily as romantic symbols in the way we understand them now, but as physical tokens of a binding legal and economic agreement, evidence that a contract had been formally sealed between two families. A ring's material and craftsmanship often reflected the financial terms of the broader marriage negotiation, a detail that connects the romantic gesture we still practice today directly back to the economic realities of arranged medieval marriage. Whether most people exchanging rings now are aware of that connection or not. Scholars examining the gradual transformation of the ring from primarily legal symbol to primarily romantic symbol suggest this shift happened slowly, unevenly, across several centuries without any single clear turning point, making it genuinely difficult to identify precisely when the ring stopped being understood mainly as evidence of contract and became understood mainly as an expression of feeling. the evidence remains incomplete on exactly how medieval people themselves experienced this dual meaning, whether they held both understandings simultaneously the way we saw earlier with astrology and religious doctrine, or whether the emphasis genuinely shifted at different points for different communities and social classes. The language of flowers we touched on briefly in an earlier part of tonight's story left behind an equally persistent legacy, one considerably more visible in modern life than most people realize. The specific association between red roses and romantic love, so thoroughly embedded in modern culture that giving red roses feels almost instinctive rather than learned traces directly back to medieval symbolic traditions that assign deliberate meaning to particular flowers and particular colours. Violets associated with modesty and quiet affection in medieval symbolic language still appear in modern floral arrangements chosen for their traditional meaning, even when the person selecting them has no conscious awareness of that inherited symbolism. This persistence raises a genuinely interesting question about how cultural meaning actually survives across centuries passed down, not through formal education or deliberate preservation, but through countless small, unexamined choices repeated generation after generation until the original reasoning behind them has faded entirely, leaving only the habit itself stripped of its original context but still somehow carrying emotional weight. Cathedral architecture itself preserves traces of this world in ways that are easy to walk past without noticing. Several surviving medieval churches across France and England contain carved decorative elements, sometimes tucked into corners or worked into the margins of larger religious scenes, depicting courting couples engaged in exactly the kind of coded, careful gestures we have spent tonight exploring: a woman offering a flower, a man kneeling with his gaze deliberately lowered in the manner conduct manuals prescribed. Art historians examining these carvings suggest they likely served a genuinely practical purpose beyond simple decoration, offering visual instruction for a largely illiterate population on proper sanctioned courtship behaviour, essentially rendering the written conduct manuals we discussed earlier into a visual language accessible to people who could not read the texts themselves. This detail matters because it reveals how thoroughly these rules of courtship were woven into the physical everyday landscape of medieval life, present not only in the private correspondence of literate nobility, but carved permanently into the public buildings where entire communities gathered each week, a constant, quiet visual reminder of exactly how affection was meant to look when performed correctly. There is a particular category of surviving evidence that offers an unusually intimate glimpse into how these customs actually persisted and transformed over the centuries following the medieval period proper, one that historians have only relatively recently begun examining with real seriousness. Marginalia, the small doodles, notes and sketches medieval scribes and readers left in the blank spaces of manuscripts, occasionally preserve informal, unguarded glimpses of romantic custom that never made it into the formal conduct manuals or legal contracts that tend to dominate the historical record. A number of surviving manuscripts contain small marginal sketches of exchanged tokens, clasped hands, or simple hearts drawn by readers or scribes in idle moments, suggesting that even within the most formal literate segments of medieval society, people still found small, unofficial ways to reward and perhaps privately celebrate romantic feeling that the official rules of the period worked so hard to constrain and channel into acceptable forms. Is it not remarkable that a monk copying a religious text by candlelight might pause in some quiet, unrecorded moment to sketch a small heart in the margin, the same simple symbol still instantly recognizable to anyone today, regardless of language or century, as shorthand for exactly the same feeling? The heart symbol itself deserves a moment of particular attention, because its history is considerably stranger and more uncertain than most people assume. The familiar, rounded, symmetrical shape we now use universally to represent love and romantic affection does not appear consistently in surviving art and manuscripts until relatively late in the medieval period, emerging gradually from roughly the 13th century onward, and its actual origin remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate rather than settled fact. Some historians propose the shape derives from stylized medieval depictions of actual anatomical hearts rendered by artists working from limited and often inaccurate understanding of internal human anatomy. Others suggest a connection to the shape of certain plant seeds, particularly silphium, a now extinct plant historically associated with both medicine and in some ancient sources, with contraception and sexuality, its seed pod bearing a notable resemblance to the symbol that would eventually come to represent love itself. Still others point to the shape's resemblance to ivy leaves, which carried their own symbolic association with fidelity and lasting attachment in medieval decorative art. Scholars still debate which explanation, if any single one, actually accounts for the symbol's origin, and it remains entirely possible that multiple visual traditions converged gradually over time to produce the shape we now recognize instantly and use without a second thought, printed on everything from greeting cards to text message keyboards, carrying almost none of the uncertainty and genuine scholarly disagreement that surrounds its actual historical origin. What makes tracing this legacy particularly meaningful beyond simple historical curiosity is what it reveals about which parts of this elaborate medieval system of courtship actually survived the centuries and which parts quietly disappeared. The romantic gestures, the flowers, the rings, the small tokens exchanged between people hoping to be understood without speaking too plainly, these persisted, softened and transformed, but still recognizably present in how people today express romantic interest. The harsher structures surrounding those gestures, the formal duels fought over a glance, the witchcraft trials triggered by a love charm, the near total authority a father held over his children's marriages, these largely did not survive, at least not in their original formal legal form, gradually dismantled across the centuries by shifting law, shifting theology, and the slow, uneven expansion of individual consent as a genuine legal and social principle, rather than simply a doctrine honoured more in theory than in daily practice. There is something worth sitting with in that particular pattern, the tenderness of the era's romantic gestures, proving more durable across time than the harsher, more controlling structures that originally surrounded and constrained them, as though the underlying human impulse toward connection managed to outlast the specific mechanisms of fear and control that medieval society had built up around it. This is not to suggest, though, that the transformation was total, or that every harmful structure from this period vanished cleanly with the end of the medieval era itself. Several historians studying the gradual evolution of marriage law across Europe caution against any tidy narrative suggesting a clean, steady march from medieval control toward modern individual choice. Arranged marriage, though transformed considerably in its specific mechanisms, persisted in various forms well beyond the medieval period in many European regions, and elements of family authority over marriage choice remained legally and socially significant in parts of Europe for centuries after the period we have spent tonight exploring. The evidence remains genuinely complicated here, resisting the satisfying shape of a story with a clear beginning, middle, and triumphant resolution. What we can say with more confidence is that the specific formal, legal, and religious mechanisms we examined tonight, the witchcraft trials targeting love charms, the near-absolute paternal authority enforced through disinheritance and convent placement, did substantially recede. As distinct medieval institutions, even as some of their underlying dynamics, family pressure, economic consideration, shaping romantic choice, echoes of which remain recognizable in various forms even now, never entirely disappeared from human experience at all. Perhaps the most genuinely surprising legacy of this entire world, though, is not found in any single surviving custom or symbol, but in something more difficult to point to directly, a particular way of thinking about love as something requiring careful expression, patient timing and deliberate gesture, rather than simple immediate declaration. Modern romantic culture, for all its apparent directness compared to the medieval world we have explored tonight, still carries recognizable echoes of this older instinct, the deliberate pacing of a new relationship, the significance placed on a carefully chosen gift or a particular gesture at a particular moment, the lingering cultural sense that some feelings are better shown than simply stated outright. Whether this represents a genuine inherited legacy passed down consciously or unconsciously across the intervening centuries, or whether it simply reflects some more universal, recurring pattern in how human beings navigate desire, regardless of specific historical period, is a question the surviving evidence cannot fully answer. And reasonable historians examining this question continue to reach different conclusions about how much weight to place on direct cultural inheritance versus simple human commonality across very different eras. What remains certain, walking back through everything this evening has uncovered together, is that the people who lived through this particular chapter of history, the young woman with her pouch of rosemary standing outside a churchyard wall, the men who drew swords over glances that were never truly about the women they claimed to defend, the daughters who fought quiet legal battles in ecclesiastical courts for the simple right to choose or refuse their own future, were never simply distant historical figures separated from us by centuries and by customs that now seem strange or even cruel. They were people navigating the same fundamental human need. We still recognize easily now the need to be seen to be chosen to matter to another person in a world that did not always make expressing that need safe or simple. The specific dangers they faced have largely receded into history. The underlying need that drove them to face those dangers anyway, again and again, letter after letter, glance after glance, has not receded at all, and it likely never fully will, regardless of how many more centuries separate us from the world we have spent tonight quietly walking through together. There is one more place this story needs to rest before the night is truly finished. Not a new fact or a new custom, but a chance to simply sit for a little while longer with everything this world has shown us about what people are willing to risk and what they are willing to endure simply for the chance to love and be loved in return. The night has carried us a long way from where we began, through churchyards and courtrooms, through scented letters and duels fought over glances that were never truly seen. And now, as the candle burns low and the story approaches its close, it is worth sitting quietly with everything this particular history has actually shown us, not as a list to be recited, but as a single connected truth finally coming into full view. We began with a look, a single carefully calibrated glance across a crowded room weighted with more legal and spiritual consequence than most modern people would ever imagine attaching to something so brief. From there, the story widened outward, the way history so often does when you follow one small thread patiently enough. A glance led to questions of scent, of how a body prepared itself to be noticed in a world without soap or privacy, and how even fragrance carried moral weight, a belief that virtue itself might announce itself through the smell of rosemary on clean skin. Scent led to language, and language revealed something almost unbearably tender. Underneath its careful religious disguise, men comparing the women they longed for to saints and cathedral light, because plain honesty about desire was in this world dangerously close to sin. And language once written down had to travel carried by uncertain messengers across roads that were never fully safe, sealed in wax scented with frankincense, arriving days later, smelling more of the journey than of the sentiment that had first been pressed into the parchment. From there, the story grew harder to hold gently, because underneath every careful gesture we examined sat real danger waiting. A glance held too long could end in a duel, blood spilled not to protect a woman's actual well-being, but to settle a contest of standing between men who barely knew her. A handful of herbs gathered with nothing but hope in mind could end in a trial, a young woman's private wish for affection reframed by frightened neighbours and anxious clergy as something dark enough to warrant real punishment. And above all of it, watching, calculating, deciding sat astrology and the church, and most powerfully of all the family, a father whose authority over his children's futures was treated as close to absolute a system that could without much hesitation trade a daughter's entire life for land for alliance, for a dowry itemized down to individual head of livestock. And yet threaded through every one of these darker chapters something else persisted as well, quieter, easier to overlook, but never actually absent. The merchant writing home to his wife with a warmth too genuine to have been performance. The church court in York that against real odds sided with the young woman who had found the courage to say no. The families who, rather than force an immediate unwanted union, chose the slower, gentler path of a lengthened engagement, giving a reluctant son or daughter time to arrive at acceptance rather than having it forced upon them all at once. History told honestly rarely resolves into something purely bleak or purely hopeful. It resolves more often into exactly what we found here, cruelty and tenderness occupying the very same world, sometimes the very same household, sometimes even the very same person. There is a particular piece of evidence worth sitting with now at the very end of this journey, because it draws together nearly everything we have walked through tonight into a single quiet, almost unbearably human image. Among the surviving records connected to marriage litigation in 14th century England, there exists a fragment badly damaged, water-stained, missing whole sections where the ink has simply faded past recovery, that appears to be a personal letter rather than a formal legal document tucked, seemingly by accident, into the folds of a larger court case file, where it had no obvious reason to be. What survives of it describes in plain and unpolished language, very different from the careful coded verses we examined earlier. This evening, a woman writing to a man she cannot yet openly claim to love, explaining that she has asked her father for more time before answering his proposal, not because she doubts the suitor put forward to her, but because she wishes in her own words as they survive on the fragment to know her own heart before she gives it away to satisfy someone else's arrangement. The document ends abruptly, the parchment torn and no further record survives, to tell us what she eventually decided, whether her father granted the delay she asked for, whether the marriage went forward as planned, whether she ever did come to know her own heart in the way she had hoped to before answering. We will never know how her story ended. And there is something genuinely important in sitting with that unresolved silence rather than rushing to imagine a satisfying conclusion for her that the evidence simply does not support. Because her fragment, incomplete and anonymous as it is, captures something that no formal conduct manual, no astrological guide, no legal contract from this entire history quite manages to capture on its own. A single ordinary person, caught inside a system built almost entirely without her voice in mind, still finding the words, however, briefly, however incompletely, to ask for something as small and as enormous as time, enough to understand her own feelings before the rest of the world decided for her. That is the entire history we have spent this evening walking through, distilled into a handful of torn, water-damaged lines. Not the duels, not the trials, not even the poetry, careful and beautiful as so much of it was. Just one woman asking quietly to be allowed to know her own heart. It is worth remembering as we come to the close of this particular story that every system we examine tonight, no matter how absolute it appeared to the people living inside it, eventually gave way. The formal machinery of arranged marriage did not disappear all at once, and elements of it lingered in various forms for centuries beyond the period we explored tonight. But the rigid, near total authority a medieval father held over his children's futures did slowly, unevenly, gradually erode, reshaped by shifting law, Shifting theology and the accumulated weight of countless small individual acts of resistance, women petitioning, church courts, families choosing patience over force, a handful of surviving letters bold enough to ask for time rather than simply comply. Power that feels permanent to the people living under it rarely turns out to be permanent at all, viewed from enough historical distance. It bends, it erodes, it gives way eventually to something else, even when the people living through its most rigid years could not possibly have imagined that shift coming in their own lifetimes. What remains long after the specific mechanisms of control have faded into old court records and university archives is something considerably harder to legislate away, something this entire history has quietly insisted on from its very first moment to its last. The simple, stubborn, universal human need to be known by another person to matter to someone beyond the practical calculations of land and lineage and family advantage. Every era constructs its own particular obstacles to that need. The medieval world built cathedrals of scripture and astrology and family law, around it elaborate, beautiful, and often cruel in equal measure. And still, somehow underneath every one of those constructed obstacles, ordinary people kept reaching for each other, anyway, in herbs and in letters, in carved cathedral corners, and in torn court fragments in ways brave enough to survive, however faintly, across 7 centuries of fire and rain and the simple indifferent passage of time. The candle by the bed has likely burned low by now, and the night has grown quiet around wherever you happen to be listening. So let the pace of this final moment slow the way it should, the way any good evening eventually does. Think one last time of that torn letter. A woman name unknown to us now asking only for a little more time. Think of the girl by the churchyard wall, her herbs pressed close against her sleeve, hope trembling faintly beneath fear. Think of the merchant far from home writing simple, honest words to a wife he plainly missed. None of them knew they would still be remembered even faintly, even anonymously, centuries after their own small, uncertain lives had ended. They were not trying to be remembered, they were only trying to be loved. And somewhere in the quiet space between what survived and what was lost to time, that is enough. The wall is still standing in a manner of speaking. The herbs have long since turned to dust. The letter has long since gone silent, its final answer lost somewhere past the tear in the parchment. But for one still hopeful moment centuries ago in the fading light of an ordinary evening, much like this one, someone reached out. That is where we leave her, reaching, hopeful, unafraid just for a moment of everything the world might do next.